Welcome to the Aspen Leadership Series, Conversations with Great Leaders in memory of Preston Robert Tisch. Today's program, Beyond Policing, Creating Safe and Just Communities, is presented in partnership with the Aspen Institute Criminal Justice Reform Initiative. Please welcome Director of the initiative, Dr. Douglas Wood.
Welcome to Beyond Policing, Creating Safe and Just Communities, an event sponsored by the Aspen Leadership Series, Conversations with Great Leaders in memory of Preston Robert Tisch in partnership with the Aspen Criminal Justice Reform Initiative. I'm Douglas Wood, Director of the Criminal Justice Initiative. The COVID-19 pandemic continues to lay bare ongoing and overlapping inequalities that exist in neighborhoods with high rates of incarceration and poverty. And after a year of protests and a time of deep, serious discussion and reflection, communities across the country are reimagining what safety and justice means to them. At hand is an increasing public support for a contemporary movement to reimagine and transform the criminal justice system while simultaneously achieving safety and justice through community-driven approaches. We are pleased to have a distinguished panel of guests and a distinguished moderator to help us grapple with these complexities. Just as a reminder to everyone, please submit your questions to us via the chat feature after the panel discussion. Now it gives me great pleasure to welcome our guests. Carol Mason, President, John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Roy L. Austin, Vice President, Civil Rights, Facebook. And Art Acevedo, Chief of Police, Houston Police Department.
Hi, everybody.
Finally, I'd like to welcome our moderator, Bill Whitaker of CBS News, by turning the program over to him. Bill? Bill, you're muted. Still muted? Bill, still muted?
How about now?
Yes, perfect.
Very
great.
Good. Very
Thanks,
good.
Bill.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We have a panel of really smart individuals. We're going to have a lively conversation that I hope will also be illuminating. So let's just get started. It's been more than 8 months since the tragic death of George Floyd. We saw some of the largest protests in our country's history calling for criminal justice reform. So, Roy, let me start with you. What impact have those protests had on social justice? What changes have they brought about?
So thank you so much, Bill, and I'm so pleased to be here with old friends, Chief Acevedo and President Mason. Look, the changes are enormous. The entire conversation around policing has shifted as a result of the killing of George Floyd. To have 2,000 communities around the country join these protests, the largest protest movement in the history of this country, most likely, to see those protests carry on across the world. We've seen community after community set up policing commissions to look at how they can reimagine policing, something that was unthought of before. And they are looking at ways to remove or to reduce the idea of locking people up and for locking people up as long. The Justice in Policing Act, which passed the House and I suspect is going to pass the Senate now that there has been a change in the Senate, is going to create change across everything that we see right now in policing, from how long people are locked up to the influence of police unions on policing. I think we are in the biggest moment of criminal justice reform that certainly I have ever seen in my lifetime. And so I think it's hard to overstate how important the protests that came out of off of the killing of George Floyd.
Chief Acevedo, you want to weigh in?
Sure. I mean, I've actually talked about this being a watershed moment. I've been a cop for almost 35 years, and nothing has touched the psyche of the American people across racial lines, across socioeconomic lines, across religious lines, nation of origin, you name it. His death really sparked something in our nation's psyche, and so. If somebody would have told me that NASCAR would have been banning the Confederate flag, and I can just go on down the line, things that we have never imagined prior to his death, it just shows you what an impact it's had. But there's still a lot of work to do, and I look forward to this conversation because I worry that we've lost a little momentum with COVID-19, and I think we need to get back on track.
So Carol, can I ask you, you led the Obama administration's National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice. In this past election, justice became one of the top campaign issues, but unfortunately, it devolved into a divisive one, pitting protesters calling for reform against law enforcement. A lot of trust was lost, but true reform requires trust. So how do you build trust among the stakeholders, and get them down to the real business of reform?
Thank you for that question. And not only was I at the Department of Justice when we launched that initiative, John Jay was the recipient of stewarding that work. So I got to see that work from its conception to completion. And what was troubling is that Minneapolis was one of our pilot sites where it was designed never to have a Michael Brown situation again. And instead we got George Floyd. So when that happened, I was devastated. But once I picked myself up and I said, okay, how do we get past this? How do we move forward? What do we learn from this? I'm always going to see things as an opportunity. So we have this moment that we're talking about is a big opportunity. So one of the things that we did at John Jay, which was founded as a police college in the 60s at a similar period of unrest in the country. And the thinking then, which I think was quite ahead of its time, was that we need law enforcement officers to have a liberal arts education to help them better partner with the communities in which they're serving. We're now much more than a police college, and we've got what I like to say is we have students who are protesting, sitting in class alongside the law enforcement officers they protest. And so as a Black woman, the first Black woman president of John Jay, I thought this is an opportunity that I need to seize. And if I don't seize it, and help us figure out how we move forward. So we started a series of conversations on the future of public safety, because I think the conversation had gotten into focusing too much on policing, and rather than taking us back to thinking about what's public safety look like and where do we need to create investments and partnerships in that. So we had a series of 6 public conversations with law enforcement leaders, union leaders, young people, advocates, everybody, public health officials. And what we designed was a roadmap for communities to have these kind of conversations, because I think that the path forward in building this trust is let's all have a conversation about what does public safety look like in our communities, and how are we going to get there, and what kind of investments do we need to make to get there. So that's, as people will tell you, we didn't get to the situation overnight. It's hundreds of years of systemic oppression, and it's going to take time to get out of it. But as Chief Acevedo said, we've got to seize this moment now and not let it pass and really act on it. And I'm encouraged by the fact that we're going to have federal partners interested in doing this hard work with us now.
Chief Acevedo, you are known for pushing change and reform in your department. How do you lead people to go in a direction that they might not be willing to follow? And how do you make that happen in a system that's often set up to resist change and resist reform?
Well, I think that's a great question, but I think, especially as it relates to police officers, and I think human beings in general, people just don't like change. We get in our comfort zones, and it's just something that is hard to accomplish sometimes. But I think the key is to explaining the why. Why are we trying to change? And how does that impact them? Why it's important for them? And for our officers, we explain to them that the court of public opinion matters. It matters to everything we do. The trust that we build or we fail to build matters. It matters to how they're going to be treated by a grand jury, by a jury. It matters to their pay, their benefits, their staffing, their equipment. So I think the key is to make sure they understand the why and why it's important for them. Then the other piece is being clear in what the direction we're going and what our end game is. And I'll be honest with you. I mean, I remember Roy when he was at DOJ. I was the brand new police chief in Austin, and right before I was selected, they announced a pattern and practice investigation into the department, and I was doing handstands, excited, because I knew as an outsider coming in that because they announced it, but they still don't get there for several months. So I hit the ground running, and what they did is that they were able to validate my observations and what we were seeing. And so when we explained to the cops that we're going to end up in a better place, and they see the public's reaction to the journey and to the transformation, you end up getting buy-in. And I'm glad to say that in our department, in this big melting pot of a city we call Houston, most diverse city in the country, we're predominantly a homegrown department that is reflective of the community that we serve. And so there is a great interest in our men and women to make sure that we're trusted by the community. And it's a win-win.
Roy, you wrote an article about, I believe you called it something about people who are below the law. I don't see it right in front of me now. I had a note down here, but you wrote an article about people who are below the law, and it was about the Shockley decision in St. Louis. And I know in St. Louis, there's a prosecutor for the city was elected to bring about reform. And she has been resisted every step of the way. I mean, she's been in office for like 4 years now. She was just reelected with a mandate. A lot of people, more than 60% of the people voted for her. I think this time more than 70% voted for her. But yet every step of the way, she is resisted by city politicians. State politicians have weighed in to try to take away some of her authority. How do you bring about reform? The other half of that question, when you are facing such mighty resistance.
I think the point of that article and a lot of the statements that that are made here is that no one is above the law, but also no one is below the law. And we see so many communities that are not only under enforced, but they are in fact they're often over enforced. So we see the over enforcement, but we don't realize that when these individuals in certain primarily Black and Latinx communities call for assistance and actually want the police there, the police don't show up. And so they feel like they are below the law, like the law doesn't care about them. An area that we haven't spent enough time on are our prosecutors. And it is the power of the prosecutors. I think the prosecutors are actually the most powerful figures in the criminal justice system, more powerful than the police, more powerful than the courts, because they decide what is going to be prosecuted. They decide how much time they're going to ask the courts for. They make enormous decisions day in and day out. The prosecutor that you're talking about, Kim Gardner, an amazingly courageous woman who saw that St. Louis day in and day out was failing to protect its Black community and was over enforcing in its Black community. And every change, as you pointed out, that she tried to make, she was hit by the powers that be that actually profit. They profit off of arresting and locking up Black bodies for minor crimes where the white community does not face the same system. And so working with Kim Gardner had been an honor for me, but working with Kim Fox in Chicago, working with Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, working with Chestnut Boudin in San Francisco, these prosecutors are changing the way we look at law enforcement. we've been locking up too many people for too long for the wrong reason for decades now. And the impact of that is being felt by our Black and our brown and our Native communities. And we have to end that. And this movement that we saw this past summer is part of ending that system.
But please, you want to weigh in? Carol?
Oh, yes. So thank you. So Roy is actually very engaged at John Jay with our Institute for Innovation and Prosecution. And we've been helping prosecutors tackle this. What they need is support from the communities, but also support from their colleagues. And that's what we're providing through the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution. And we've been having convenings talking about officer involved shootings and how do they handle that so that they've got this community of practice around them, supporting them as they're trying to do this difficult work. But I think that as Roy mentioned, we've got a new breed of prosecutors who are thinking about their role in creating safe communities, and that their role is not just to prosecute, but it's to really be just and help support the strength and health of their communities. And by their prosecutorial discretion, that's their biggest tool to do that. And also, as the DA in Brooklyn will tell you, and he was one of our panelists, that he meets with the community to talk to them about how can we support you in bringing about safe communities and investing resources in those communities as well. Prosecutors have much more bandwidth to do things than people think of in their traditional role.
What I observed in St. Louis is that the resistance that the prosecutor is facing has generated a level of frustration, but it's also generated, it's gotten people fired up. So more people are getting involved, more people are voting, more people are showing up at City Hall. So, I mean, it's, people are paying attention today in ways that we haven't paid attention in a generation.
Absolutely.
So, Chief Acevedo, you were praised for marching with protesters early in the summer, but at a congressional hearing in June, you opposed some of the protesters' calls for defund the police, calling it a false equivalence. You said that meaningful reforms were needed. What are the reforms you consider to be most meaningful and most needed?
Well, I mean, first of all, let me just say that I still go out and patrol in my black and white, spend a lot of time out in the community. And I think sometimes the voices that lead these conversations may not be as close to the communities they think they are. My black and brown and poor communities that are most impacted by crime, they don't want less policing, they want better policing. And my false equivalence is this country can afford both. They can afford, if COVID hasn't shown us that with the trillions that they have printed overnight when it impacted all of Americans, we can invest in socioeconomics, we can invest in education, we can invest in all the things that are so desperately needed, and we can invest in good policing. And for me, good policing is about accountability, systems of accountability. It's about police departments that are focused on being smart on crime and just on crime and not tough on crime, because it's not about toughness, it's about effectiveness. It's about keeping people safe. And to me, reform has to start with making sure that out of the 18,000 police departments in this country, the big departments are always pretty visible. And when we fall short, because we can actually afford the body-worn cameras, thank God, it's out there. But there are 18,000 police departments in this country, and a lot of the problems that really cause the mistrust are in a lot of these agencies that don't have policies and procedures and progressive policies. So I think that we need to come up with at least national standards as it relates to use of force reporting. Think about this for a minute. We were marching out there, these young people, and they were so angry that what we all saw when we saw George Floyd for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, which is something you have to be committed to be able to kneel down like that for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, especially in a full uniform. A man calling for his mom. They were so angry that what appeared to all of us as a crime that had been committed, a murder that had been committed, that it took days and it took an eternity for them. And what I had explained to them was, well, part of the problem is that that technique was not only not prohibited, it was trained, it was authorized. And that complicates the prosecution. To think that in today's environment, we still have departments that authorize these dangerous techniques is I think is unfathomable, but it's the reality we're facing. And we've got to pay attention to the policies, the training and the procedures and all these other things. Otherwise, we'll be having this conversation summer after summer and year after year.
Let me just throw in, I mean, I met Art when I was at the Department of Justice because they had done that review of the Austin Police Department. And they made a series of, let's say it was about 100 recommendations to the Austin Police Department. And when the Department of Justice does this with other police departments, most of them push back. What Art said is he looked down this list, he said, I'm going to do every single one of these things. And so when it came time to decide, do we put Austin under a consent decree? Do we seek a consent decree there, or do we let it go? We said, well, he's done everything. I think there was like one thing which he pushed back on and said, it's actually impossible for me to do it, or it's illegal under Texas law. But beyond that,
it was the way pepper spray canisters.
It was something like that. But otherwise, and look, the Task Force on 21st Century Policing provided a roadmap for every police department in this country. It's sitting right there. If every police department in this country would take an honest look at whether or not they're doing everything, that it's like 60 recommendations, we would be in a much better place. But we have a lot of police departments who refuse to hold their officers accountable, and people see, this is the whole idea of procedural justice. Young Black people see police officers or young white kids being treated differently than they're treated. And if you don't have a system of justice, then people aren't going to believe in justice and people aren't going to feel the need to follow the law. And so we've got to get ourselves there through systems of accountability, to professionalizing policing where it's not professionalized, to moving things out of the criminal justice system into the health system. There are things that we could do, and we can do them immediately, but we need commitment from those 18,000 police departments and from prosecutors who are looking at prosecutions differently and from courts that are looking at things differently.
May I add one thing to this conversation? Because I think it goes back to what Chief Acevedo said earlier about culture change. Because the thing that I don't want people to miss is we had spent years in Minneapolis and significant money training in procedural justice, implicit bias, racial reconciliation. And we've done that deep work. Everybody in that department, civilian and sworn officers, had this training, and it still happened. And so that's why, to me, that I said, that disillusionment was like, why did this still happen with that kind of investment? And it's culture change. It's hard. It's accountability. The one thing that I can say was a success out of it is we had gotten them, because of the policies, to change and say that if you disobey the policy, you can be fired. And so they fired them right away instead of going through the normal union process. So, but how do you weed out that officer? Should have been weeded out earlier, because as Chief Acevedo said, that took intentionality to do what he did. For somebody who we thought they passed a counterfeit $20 bill, why was that kind of force even necessary? And so I think that we've got to really do some, not just soul searching and education and standard setting, but we've got to think about who we have in the police department. And somebody told me this yesterday, was talking to the NYPD. When people say they're bad apples, well, this is a profession that can't afford bad apples. And you need to figure out how to make sure you have all good apples, and that understanding people will make mistakes, but giving people the tools and the training and the education so that they approach the work differently and approach the work as if everybody's life is important. The sanctity of everybody's life in an encounter is important.
Can I just say something that I think is really important from my perspective? Look, our community understands that the one constant in terms of the human condition is imperfection. They understand that no matter our systems, our processes, our procedures, our policies, that you cannot guarantee that you're not going to end up with someone not doing the right thing. I mean, that's why we have prisons and all those other things. The problem with policing, I believe, isn't the cops. I think it's leadership. I think it's leaders that do not hold people accountable. I think that this old notion that we've been hearing, and I'm starting to talk about this now, I think Roy and Carol will be happy, is that we've been saying lawful but awful. Well, whether it's lawful or not, if it's awful, what makes it awful is that officers completely abandoned their training. People know what a felony stop looks like. Instead, the officers bum rush. Next thing you know, we shoot somebody that had we just stayed back. We won't know how to shoot. We have got to demand leadership that holds people accountable, because at the end of the day, no matter what your processes, your systems, your procedures, if you don't hold people accountable, that's what makes people angry. And I'll give you the example of here in Houston, Harding Street. We had a horrible situation where we had a raid and 2 people ended up dead inside that residence. 4 officers ended up shot. Horrible. But guess what? This police department uncovered the malfeasance, investigated it. One of the officers is charged with murder. We had the Nicholas Chavez shooting, where a young man in crisis and under the influence, both mental, because what comes first? The chicken or the egg? I mean, it was both in this young man. We ended up shooting him. Community was angry. But once they see accountability, that's what they want. It's the lack of accountability when people see the lawful but awful or something they know is wrong that really destroys, I think, public trust. I really believe that.
That's what you were doing there in Houston. How do you make that more the norm? How do you make that? You see in time after time in New York, in Baltimore, you just go down the list of cities where people see something horrible. It happens on camera, and yet the officer involved often gets off. And people say, I saw you choke this person. I saw you shoot this person. And yet the officer often gets off. So how do you bring about what you're talking about, make that more the norm?
I think that part of the problem is that we got to take a close look at contracts. We got to take a close look at, because police departments, a lot of times, the problems are as a result of elected officials. See, the police department doesn't negotiate contracts across the country. It truly is either a city manager or a mayor and council. And sometimes they give away management rights to the detriment of good policing. They give away the ability to conduct investigations. One of the things that I'm working on here, and that I want to change, that I inherited, was, I have to show my officers, and believe me, you can come and visit, you're going to find that we're holding people accountable. Despite this, we have to show them every statement that every witness made. You got to give them all the evidence, right? Well, we don't do that with bad guys on the streets. And, that's when you're a police officer, that is part of the cost of being a police officer, the burden. You have to be able to answer the tough questions. But those are the kind of things that we have to look at that I think hampers investigative efforts. And in some locations, I won't mention any, but more in the East Coast, the rights of some of these, it's almost impossible in some locations to fire people. So I think that the public needs to take a hard look at collective bargaining agreements with some of these police unions.
Yeah, Bill, I mean, one of the most ridiculous rules that exists for police officers is the fact that when they are involved in a use of force, they don't have to give a statement for 24 hours or maybe 72 hours. In Louisiana, I think it's a full week, because they are supposedly so traumatized by that use of force. But you name any witness to a crime and you tell the police, you know what, give me 24 hours to meet with my buddies, to meet with a lawyer, and then I'll give you a statement. It's not happening. But you take the most well-trained individuals and you tell them, okay, take some time and then come back to us and give us a statement. In many jurisdictions, the police get to look at the body camera video before they make a statement to make sure that they are aligning their statement with that body camera video. These are ridiculous rules that police unions have been able to push through. They don't belong. They shouldn't have them. Again, look, it's a hard job. I'm going to grant you that. It's a very difficult job. It is a dangerous job. But when you do something wrong, you got to be held accountable. And then a lot of jurisdictions are just afraid to hold their police officers accountable because the police union is going to build a huge budget to take out the elected official from office, take the elected official out of office. Look, you got to just lean on doing right. And sometimes you're going to lose your job when you do the right thing. But at the end of the day, you have yourself and having done the right thing. So law enforcement needs to be treated like other people. And that's just not the way it is. And so that's why over years and years, decades and decades, and look, you look at New York, you look at the Floyd case. New York City police officers were stopping and frisking Black and brown people, majority Black and brown people, like 600,000 times. 600,000 times. The Floyd case comes through, it drops down to 10,000 times, and the crime rate in New York goes down. Well, for those 500,000 New Yorkers, Black and brown New Yorkers who were stopped and frisked, they were traumatized by that. It's not just one of those things where, oh, you weren't doing wrong, so who cares if the police stop you and frisk you and do everything else? That's not the way it works. When you're on the other end of that stop and frisk, that impacts you. That impacts your willingness to cooperate with police. And this is happening around the country. They're just kind of throwing out this net and just like, we'll stop and frisk and you look like you could be a suspect. We got to do better, Bill. We got to do better.
A lot of times, facts and logic don't play into it. A few years ago, I did a story about comparing the German prison system with the American prison system. The German prison system is designed to get people out of prison. What can I do to get you out of here and get you back into society as a productive member of society? And the whole idea of punishment doesn't really factor in. And they have proof that this works. People get out of prison. The recidivism rate is much, much lower than ours. But Americans want the person to be punished for that crime. So that's a part of our whole process. We put the person in prison so they can pay for their crime. And then after 15 years, you throw them back out in the street, and they're worse offenders. What do we do about that?
What's interesting when you say that people want punishment, when we've done the work through the Office of Victims of Crime that's under OJP and talk to victims of crime, what they'll tell you in most cases is it's not about retribution and punishment. They want to make sure it doesn't happen again, and then nobody does that again. And so I think that we need to move away from this mentality that the only response to crime is locking someone up. And I don't want to lose sight of the fact that one of the things we talked about early on, or alluded to early on, is we need to be making investments in other places so that we minimize the encounters that police have to respond to for crime, so that they can do the job that they really ought to be doing, which is dealing with violent crime, real crime, not circumstantial crime. And so if you're investing in schools and jobs and communities and safe housing and dealing with homelessness and dealing with mental health, so that we're not asking our police officers to respond to things that they shouldn't respond to, then we can focus on getting people the resources they need so they can thrive. Then we minimize those people who wind up in our criminal justice system. But those that do, then the question is what do we do with that person? Because most people are 90+% of people are going to come home from prison. And so the question is prison the right place? That, there's a lot of movement now about, and has been for a while, about alternatives to incarceration. Prison should not be the default. We ought to be looking at what's happening, how can we support this person, particularly our young people. And when I say young people, I'm not just talking about juveniles, I'm talking about people up to 25 years old, because there's plenty of research that shows brain development, impulse control, all those things, that young people respond to things differently. So get them back on track instead of, as you say, warehousing them in prison and they come back out worse than they went in. So I think that to Chief Acevedo and Roy's point earlier about how are we shoring up our communities so that that people have an opportunity to thrive, so that they're not winding up in our criminal justice system.
We were talking earlier about a culture change. It's even trickled down into the way we talk to each other. It's almost like we can't have this kind of conversation that we're having here on a broader scale. If you say Black Lives Matter, somebody pushes back and say, well, Blue Lives Matter. If you say defund the police, they'll push back and say, well, then you live with the crime that happens if you take the money away from police. And you know that when people say defund the police, they're actually talking about, as you're saying here, find other ways that police aren't always the best response, perhaps social work, perhaps, mental health. That's what the defund the police actually means, but people want to make political points by jumping on it and making us all feel bad about the way we're approaching these issues. We can't even talk to each other. So it makes me concerned about how we're going to have the sensible reforms you all are talking about. How do we do that?
But I think you can. So our series of 6 conversations prove that you can get people to talk about it if you frame it right and give them the opportunity and the space to have that conversation. And I suspect from the things that Chief Acevedo is saying that he's created space for the community to have those kind of conversations. And that's what you've got to do. There are many police departments that are doing it right and doing it well and leading the conversations in their communities for how, to deal with these issues. In LaGrange, Georgia, the chief there, he's become the broker between the politicians and other folks because they trust the police there to bring them together to deal with the real issues that need addressing. And a chief like Chief Acevedo, you've got persuasive power and a voice. If you've got the police chief saying, I need you all to be thinking about investing in the schools here, investing in that, they're going to hear it because he's not saying, give me more money for police. You want it. It's not an either or, as you said, it's not an either or situation, but to use the power of his voice of saying, these are the kinds of things and investments, but giving people a space to have that conversation and having the right people at the table. And that's part of the roadmap we gave in our future policing report, because I wanted to figure out how do we give people a roadmap to have these difficult conversations. And it takes a commitment to stay at the table, stay in the conversation, because you're going to hear things you don't want to hear. You're going to be called things you may not want to be called, but you got to stay at the table and have the conversation anyway. And I think, again, that's why Chief Acevedo is having a different outcome, because he's staying at the table and having these conversations.
Can I respond? I mean, this has been react to a couple of things. My mind's been going 100 miles an hour. Look, I think the problem in our nation, and I want to pick on the media a little bit, Mr. Whitaker, is that, defund the police means different things to different people. There's actually abolitionists, but in their idea is we should have no police. I think the problem is, and the frustration is that voices of moderation and common sense and give and take and focus on policy and not politics or primary politics get drowned out by the extremes on both ends. And then what happens is that we get nothing done. I mean, one of my biggest concerns is, prison should be and jail should be about rehabilitation. We're all about that. And right now, what's happening in too many big cities is that folks, instead of being smart on crime, they want to treat not everyone's the same. We've got to be thoughtful. A bond reform. People should not be in jail because they can't afford bond. Making decisions as to whether somebody should remain in custody should be based on a threat to public safety, reoffending, those type. What is the risk assessment? Not about money. But what's happening in a lot of jurisdictions right now is that we have people that are dangerous that are coming in and they're being treated like they're there for, shoplifting when they're actually killing people. And I can just tell you that what's worrying me right now is there's so much legitimate criminal justice reform that has not been accomplished that if we're not careful with violent crime starting to go up, we're going to have a backlash back to the right. And so I think that we all need to come together, use our intellect, and have a focus on criminal justice that is just, that is timely, and that is certain. And that means, that when we can, we try to rehabilitate people. We try to divert people. We're doing that here all the time. You're welcome to come and visit us. But it certainly doesn't mean that people with a history of violence, because what really angers me sometimes is some of the people pushing that policy that nobody should be held because of the presumption of innocence are the same people that say, well, we have only had, it's taken 3 to 5 years to get murder case and violent criminals through the process. How about justice, you're supposed to have timeliness, right? It's supposed to be speedy. So we've got to bring everyone in from their corners, and we need to come in here and focus on what makes sense. Because I'm telling you that when I drive around this city and I talk about people are scared, and they're black and brown people, and they're scared because there are those that are not being smart, and they're just pushing some really, I think, reckless policies on both ends of the extreme, on both extremes. The throw away the key, lock them up and throw away the keys. The let's treat young people and adolescent behavior like criminal behavior instead of do what it really is young people acting out. You know, some guy mentioned my mother, Richard Quintero, I'm 56. I still remember Richard Quintero mentioned my mother in freshman year. He got popped in the nose. That same punch today in too many places gets you a criminal summons. Those are the things we need to be focusing on.
And I think we also have to level set here a little bit. The criminal justice reform movement is actually pretty new. I mean, I remember being in the Obama administration, and for the first 4 years, it was hard to have any conversation about criminal justice reform. What, do you want to let all the criminals out? You want to let all the murderers out? And it wasn't until kind of the middle of that administration, and former Attorney General Eric Holder can tell you the hate that he was faced with, and even starting to have this conversation about reforming the criminal justice system. And so we were moving in this direction, but kind of in the midpoint to the end of the Obama administration. And then we started seeing the right come on board, and the right was coming on board. The religious right was coming on board because of a belief that people could be better, that the economics of our criminal justice system were becoming overwhelming. We saw Texas suddenly jump in on criminal justice reform. And so the movement is still rather new. And we can't ignore the fact that the law and order nonsense that happened over the last 4 years really hurt the movement, really and truly hurt the movement. And where you had police officers starting to have this conversation in a way that they'd never had it before, you had them fall back into the law and order, and to the where you have a president talking about banging a suspect's head against the car window, against the door frame. That actually stepped us back. And you saw a document from the Fraternal Order of Police talking about how we have to get rid of the rules banning racial profiling. And so now we got to pick back up from where we were, and I think we can do it. And I see this. I'm involved in a program called Active Bystandership for Law Enforcement. It's called ABLE. And the one thing we didn't talk about with George Floyd is you had the one officer with his knee in George Floyd's neck, but you had 3 other officers there who didn't do anything. We're talking about empowerment. Police officers know when their fellow officer is not doing the right thing, and we have to empower them to take the steps to say to their buddy and say, hey, we shouldn't be doing this. Hey, you need to go get some help. Hey, this community deserves the same policing as this wealthy community over here. And I think we have to turn the table and start getting back in that direction. But we have to undo, honestly, 4 years worth of damage to the criminal justice reform effort.
Well, I'm just going to respectfully disagree with my colleague a little bit. I do think that we lost some ground because we didn't have the national voice was different. But most criminal justice issues are state and local, and that's what people don't understand. What you do have is you have a federal bully pulpit that was used irresponsibly, in my opinion, over the last 4 years. But a lot of good work was still happening at the state and local government level in terms of focusing on being smart on crime. And they're still focused. And that's why I'm saying now that we've got some federal leadership willing to partner with us, I think we can make up that ground quickly and move a lot further. But the work was still happening. And I don't want to lose sight of the fact that there were good people still working hard in their communities to be smart on crime.
And let me agree with Carol on that. Yes. But when you have the message coming from the federal government emboldening some of the worst instincts in your union leadership, in some of your individual officers, it matters. It matters. It makes Chief Aceveto's job that much harder because he's trying to send one message, and then from the federal government, you're getting a completely different message. Look at all the programs that you started at the Office of Justice Programs, Carol, where money and resources and the Task Force on 21st Century Policing, those things were pulled back, where we were talking to posts, police officer standards and training around the country. that we're ready to start adopting those things on a national level. So to touch 18,000 police departments and to start getting some uniformity, it's going to require national leadership. And so I don't disagree with you at all. There's some great people who are continuing to do great things, but that national leadership matters so much. It matters so much.
So, Bill,
It's been a great conversation, but we've got some, I'm here in New York, we're probably going to hear the sirens go by. But we've got some questions coming in from our viewers, if we could start with that. There's one here. What are your views on private prisons and the implications for effective reform?
Get rid of them.
I'm private
Now. Can't profit off of people being incarcerated. It's an awful idea. They need to be gone.
Absolutely.
You got unanimity. They need to go.
Well, criminal justice should never be. You can't have justice is not a for profit ever,
Right.
Because when people are profiting out of someone being in prison, who's to say that you good behavior credit ain't going to be quite there when they need to, when they're focused on the bottom. On the bottom line. So absolutely, I think most police chiefs and most thoughtful people recognize that should not be a for-profit proposition.
And some people would probably argue they were outsourcing the issue and they thought it would be more cost effective, but that's not what prison's for. And
which I just had this conversation. I'm going to throw this out real quick to you all, because I don't think that reform should be a for-profit proposition. And we have created a cottage industry for police monitors that we're spending millions of dollars on police monitors that you kind of incentivize not getting the departments off of. And, there's been some debate. I would hope that we create professional staff from the federal government or somewhere else that are going to get a paycheck, whether someone's in a consent decree or not. So that's something that we've been talking about with the new administration, because I do worry about any part of the criminal justice system being a for-profit proposition.
And that includes the bail industry.
Absolutely.
Here's another one. They want to know, what effect do all of these efforts have on black murders in the Black community?
Well, I can start over here. I'm just telling you that, we don't talk enough about victims, and whether victims is what I became a police officer for: two things: to keep people safe and out of a sense of patriotism. And at the end of the day, some will use it. Well, the crime is black on black crime. You know what? Doesn't matter. That's not the point. That we want fairness, we want equity, and we want justice. And regardless of who's committing the crime, everybody needs to be treated the same. And quite frankly, when you look at similarly situated people in this country, what we still don't understand is that people are treated differently depending on their pocketbook. And in many instances, because whether it's by design or not, people that look like this panel disproportionately, when it comes to socioeconomics, we're not on the top of the scale. A lot of people that look like us, so they don't get the same treatment. And I think that that's what we need to focus on: keeping people safe and making sure that everybody by the criminal justice system is being treated the same. Justice be blind, and I don't think it is in this country.
And look, the black on black crime thing is nonsensical, because black on black crime happens just as often as white on white crime. Okay, homicides happen within the communities where you spend most of your time. And so that whole idea is nonsensical. But when you look at the systemic racism, and when you take a young man's son, you take a father from a young man for some nonsense, the stuff we've been doing with fines and fees forever, where we lock up someone because they owe some money, or we take away their car because they owe some money, and then how are they supposed to support their family? And you look at the actual data, and the data shows that if you are a black young man in this country, you are more likely to be kicked out of school, you're more likely to be arrested, you're more likely to be stopped, you're more likely to be sentenced for longer amounts of time than you were for the same crime if you were white. So the fact that the criminal justice system has impacted the black community more so than it may have the white community is a reflection of decades going back to the 60s of an unequal policing and courts, and prosecuting in the Black community.
And you can't separate that from systemic poverty.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was going to add, Carol. I mean, you know, a lot of young people of color are born into circumstances, and there's no investment in them. You know, I was criticized here in Texas. I wrote an op-ed piece supporting pre-K funding, and the Tea Party said because the governor, I have to give him this one, wanted to provide $117 million additional dollars for pre-K, and they called it welfare. And my response was, absolutely. It's about the welfare of children. Imagine that. What kind of Judeo-Christian society complains? And, you know, the Tea Party's to their right, supposed to be people of faith. We need to invest. And part of the reason we have violence in our inner cities, in our communities of color, and including poor white communities, because there's a lot of poor white people in this country. Nobody talks about them. Then people want to know why they're so angry. Economics plays a big role. Your circumstances play a big role because these kids, while the haves are they're going to pre-K, then they're going to after-school programs, and they're going to summer programs. The have-nots are running in the streets and being seduced by bad people. And so it starts with investing in young people and investing in jobs programs, in education programs, and after school programs, and summer programs, and intern programs. And don't tell me that we can't do both, have good policing and invest in the communities of color and poor communities.
And he just made my point. People are going to hear that differently from him than they're going to hear it from me. And that's the kind of conversation and advocacy that we need to have happen.
We have another question here. Is there a department? Is there a good example of de-escalation training in the country?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned the ABLE program, which is out of Georgetown, which is not for profit, active bystandership in law enforcement. And the whole idea is to teach law enforcement officers to pull back. When an officer is starting to lose their cool, their partner taps them on the shoulder and says, you know what, let me take this. When an officer is acting inappropriately, you know, you back them off. It's a different kind of de-escalation, but it's making sure that those who are closest to the officers are the ones who are intervening and helping those officers to make better and right decisions. And then we just need to make a law on de-escalation. Right now, the law really promotes, if you see someone that's acting up, go ahead, use force on them. The law needs to switch on that and move toward toward requiring that the first step for an officer is, how do I calm down this situation? When you have someone in mental health crisis, officers attack. It's this whole guardianship warrior mentality where we need our officers to be guardians of our communities and not warriors invading our communities. So there's a lot of work being done there. Sorry, Carol, go ahead.
Sorry, I thought you were done. It's a little more complicated because the two officers in Atlanta, Georgia, my hometown, with the gentleman who fell asleep at the Pizza Hut, not pizza, whatever it was, I don't know. And
that was a Wendy's. It was a Wendy's.
Yeah, that's what it was. When there were two officers there, and one of them was de-escalating it, and they had just had de-escalation training, and then one of them just got hotter and headed. And you know, they could have just let the man walk home. He offered to walk home, and the question is, why didn't that happen? And they'd just been trained, so there's something not happening. That the training is just not sufficient in and of itself. And I suspect that part of it is it takes repetitive and accountability, you know, repeated action, repeated reminding, repeated happening, and the combination of what Roy talked about as well. But it's what we're doing is not enough.
I have a big question, but little time. One person wanted to know, when we think about the culture of policing, I wonder what you folks can say about the role of white supremacy. And it says from that FBI report over the past 2 decades. We have a couple of minutes for this answer. So who would like to dive in?
Well, one place I'd look is if you see the work of the Plain View Project that looked at the social media posts from law enforcement, it picked 6 to 8 cities. Mm-hmm. It was awful. It was absolutely awful. The most vile, racist, sexist, homophobic comments by law enforcement. And too few of those officers face repercussions for that. And so the fact that, you know, you're seeing significant numbers of law enforcement that are touching on white supremacy, if not fully engaged on it, is something that has to be rooted out. And we have to find it, and it has to be removed. Those people don't deserve to be police officers, because you have to be representing your entire community, all shades of your community, the genders in your community, everything else. And you can't have that in law enforcement.
I think we just, you know, I'm the president of the Major State Chiefs Association, which is a 69 large police departments in the United States and 9 largest in Canada. We just spent a couple of days on these Zoom meetings I'm tired of, quite frankly. I like people. I want to see people and I'll hold them. It's hard to build relationships without interacting. But that was the top of our conversation. And for anyone to think that there aren't white supremacists or militia types or extremists within the ranks of law enforcement, our people come from society. We've got people in the newsroom that are white supremacists. We've got people in the boardroom that are white supremacists. I mean, look at the insurrectionists that ended up hitting the Capitol. There were cops, there were military, there were teachers, there were business people, CEOs. So we have to acknowledge that they're there. But fortunately, I still believe that that's still the exception in terms of the American people. But we've got to do everything we can to identify them and root them out. And we'll be putting out an actual statement as Major State Chiefs. Hopefully next week. We're drafting it now to make sure people understand there's zero tolerance. And let me just say this, Roy. If you show your heart in terms of being a racist or an extremist, you have no business in law enforcement. What I loved about the George Floyd protest and what I love about social media is that it gave people the opportunity to act without thinking and post things. And I can tell you, if you look at my department, there are people that posted some things that were racist. And if you come looking for them, they're not here. They're gone. And so, you know, social media has been bad for this country. But the good thing is that when people sometimes get overwhelmed with their own extremist views and they post something, it gives an opportunity to weed people out. So I'm thankful for that.
Chief, Carol, Roy, I knew you'd be a great panel. Thank you. And this was lively and it was illuminating. We thank you very much, and we could carry this on for another hour, but our time has run out.
Well, we're all sorry about that. I'm Linda Lara from the Aspen Institute, and on behalf of the Institute and my co-host, Doug Wood, I want to thank our speakers, Carol, Roy, Chief Acevedo, and Bill, for a very important and insightful conversation, or let's say the beginning of a conversation that needs to go on. I'd also like to thank the sponsors who make programs like tonight's possible. For the Conversations with Great Leaders series, Steve Tisch, Lori Tisch, Lizzie and Jonathan Tisch, and the Lori M. Tisch Illumination Fund. For the Criminal Justice Reform Initiative, Arnold Ventures, Ascendium Education Group, Bank of America Charitable Foundation, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, Maya and Mike Crothers, and Google. And finally, a very sincere thank you to all of you who tuned in, and hopefully we'll keep the conversation going. Both Doug and I will be in touch about future programs. Thank you for coming.